So, at this point, I can safely say that over the years I've developed a complex relationship with the Dragon Age franchise. I consider Origins to be a masterpiece. It's a game that I absolutely adore and love. My experience playing it is permanently ingrained in my consciousness. It's simply a game that gave me exactly what I liked at precisely the right time. As a teenager playing it, every moment was satisfaction. Dragon Age 2 gave me an okay experience. It gave me just enough Dragon Age to scratch my itch. Then, later on, when Inquisition rolled around, I was still in love with the franchise enough to be hyped for it. But then, that game did things and took me places that left me with a rather conflicted takeaway, something I have extensively detailed in videos prior. The end result is that I have had my ups and downs with this franchise, with extremes ranging from absolute love to sheer frustration. Dragon Age has taken me places that I absolutely adore, but has also managed to serve me with its fair share of disappointments. Which brings us to the latest entry to the franchise, Veilguard. And oh boy has this one been a doozy. I mean, I had tacit excitement in anticipation of this game's release. On the one hand, I'm a Dragon Age diehard. On the other, Inquisition did things with the franchise I simply did not like. Veilguard promised to continue and really build on Inquisition's legacy, and that did put me off a bit. I still held out hope, however, that I would find some enjoyment in the series' fourth entry. But never did I ever expect the amount of controversy this game would cause. It literally became a hot-button topic in pop culture at large, attracting an avalanche of discussion, criticism, and vitriol. Everyone was talking about this game. Prominent YouTubers, not just gamers, but pop culture analysts, were commenting on this game. The discussions online fragmented into very conflicting takes. On the one hand, some die-hard Dragon Age fans whose opinions on the franchise I trust were singing the game's praises. On the other, pop culture critics whose line of thought I generally agree with on a lot of issues were dragging this game through the mud. I heard the full gambit of criticism. The art style was too cartoony, the tone was all wrong, not really being dark fantasy, the writing of the game was lambasted as weak, and some choices made with the game related to certain elements and characters were labeled as another example of wokeness, superseding creative vision to include forced, ideologically motivated representation. To be honest, I was taken aback at this reaction. I was confused. Who could I trust? Which opinion should I listen to? Eventually, I decided to pick up the game and honor my loyalty to the franchise, trying to put all the chatter surrounding it to the side and just simply give it a chance. The decision to take a step away from the conversation online and experiencing the game for myself was a wise one. Beyond having the necessary knowledge and experience to take a step back and assess from my perspective, this decision allowed the fog of war to clear, which helped me think clearly. All of a sudden, I was struck with a realization that really helped me make sense of what was happening. The level of division, this level of controversy, it all seemed logical all of a sudden. The way this game was made, the choices made, and the reaction to it, it's all a sign of something much more all-encompassing than just whatever went down at BioWare during game development. This game can most accurately be seen as simply a product of its time. What it is, the reaction it caused, it is absolutely fitting to the cultural landscape of the time we live in. But in order to defend this assertion, I'm first going to go over some of the main criticisms levied at the game and give my take on each one. I will not cover every possible criticism, nor will I unpick every story beat and element in this game. Firstly, because there has already been plenty of discourse on the topic and there is very little I can add that would be original and insightful. And secondly, doing that would necessitate this video become massive in size, which is something I would like to avoid. And in the end, to conclude this analysis, I will give my explanation as to why, at the end of the day, what this game is and the reaction to it is ultimately something that should have been expected and why it was entirely natural. Needless to say, spoilers ahead. So, starting with the first criticism I wish to talk about, this isn't a worthy Dragon Age sequel. The history of the franchise is truly a confusing one. I will be the first to say, some of the direction and vision that drove some of the decisions that define this franchise are truly baffling. Taking a broader look at the whole progression ever since Origins, I can't help but get a sneaking suspicion that BioWare kind of hates Origins or is like frustrated that this game was actually successful. The reason I say that is that every game since Origins has made the conscious effort to move further and further away from what Origins was. Everything from redefining art styles and overhauling combat since Dragon Age 2 has been focused in that direction. Inquisition was a drastic step away from Origins, both in art style and game mechanics, taking it even further along that path after Dragon Age 2. And you have to wonder why. Like, people at BioWare apparently have never heard the saying that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Apparently so, as BioWare have been seemingly doing nothing but fixing things that were never broken to begin with. Like, people adored Origins. The Dragon Age fanbase was created because of what that game was. BioWare didn't even expect Origins to be as successful, and yet it took off. The very reason why any sequels exist at all is that Origins actually turned out to be as successful, conquering the hearts and minds of players. And yet, BioWare have made nothing but a conceited effort to redefine what this franchise is and take every following installment further away from what made Origins great. You really have to question the mentality behind this backwards thinking. Instead of capitalizing on the success of Origins, keeping what works and giving players what they actually want, BioWare kept fixing problems that never really existed while changing elements that actually the fans loved. For example, the combat. Who really gave a damn about the more wooden combat of Origins? Okay, sure, add some changes and try to address some of the limitations Origins' combat had, but who really had like a big issue with the combat to begin with? People adored Origins for its world building, characters, and story. The combat was an afterthought. Was there really a huge demand after Origins for a combat system overhaul? Yet, for some reason, ever since DA2, BioWare has put extensive emphasis on trying to overhaul the combat system, making a point of highlighting that. Another example is the open world of Inquisition. Like, because apparently the maps in Origins were too small or something. What about the multiplayer in Inquisition? Who the hell was actually clamoring for a multiplayer in these games? I have a sneaking suspicion that the developers really didn't want to make more Dragon Age RPGs like Origins and wanted to instead do something else and use the Dragon Age name really as an excuse to explore making other types of games. Which brings us to the star of the show, Veilguard. Veilguard follows suit in this vein. It gives you flashy combat. Some people have panned the combat as being repetitive, and I can definitely see that, but that's really beside the point. In Veilguard's combat, I see the culmination of what BioWare have been trying to achieve with combat in the franchise ever since Dragon Age 2. Movement is smooth, combat is hectic, we have flashy moves with big animations and abilities, with lots of colors and motion on screen, and while we have inklings of that in 2 and Inquisition, here the whole thing really does feel the most polished it has ever been. So, I guess on that front we could mark this as a success. The problem is, however, no one was really looking to get this out of a Dragon Age game to begin with. Which fans were really concerned with and were looking for flashy, polished combat? Like I previously said, people fell in love with Origins for a plethora of other factors, and the combat was never really anyone's concern. So, to put so much emphasis on it is just weird. And this is only the beginning. The game goes further in walking away from some of the elements people actually liked about Origins. The biggest issue here is tone. Some of the new additions to the story and lore feel directly and distinctly out of place, cartoony at times, and some are, I would go so far as saying, downright anti-fantasy. Let's start with the art style. In some respects, it's fine. Like, I like some of the character designs, and while some people did not dig it, I was fine with it. But some of the design choices related to the wider world are baffling. The demons in this game look weird. Instead of the very gruesome and flashy, downright horror movie-esque designs of earlier games, the demons have been reduced to these generic, flashy, plastic-looking creatures. I mean, compare the designs of the sloth demon and how truly horrifying that thing looked in Origins to the cartoony way the pride demons look in Veilguard. This redesign poses issues twofold. One, the original design contributed to the dark and gritty tone that people actually loved. Secondly, by changing it, you are walking away from something that worked and that was iconic to the franchise for no visible gain. On the one hand, when you undermine the tone, you end up with a game that does not feel like a spiritual successor to what the franchise was known to be. On the other hand, going against the established known designs, you are going against what fans have come to expect and love out of this franchise. In both cases, you are going against fan expectations, failing to give them elements that they loved from previous games. And the demons are not even the worst example. That crown goes to the Darkspawn. The original Darkspawn worked. Those designs were perfect. Why change them? And yet, in this game, they look incredibly goofy and cartoony. I mean, the first time I saw an ogre in this game, I thought it looked like something out of A Nightmare Before Christmas rather than something out of a Dragon Age game. But the fact that the Darkspawn look like they live right next door to Jack Skellington is barely scratching the surface as far as the tone of the game being way too cartoony. A prime example of this that cuts even deeper is the character of Bellara, and by extension of her, the Veil Jumpers as a faction. I mean, just look at this scene.
Cut it down!
I'm trying! It's not working! I can't contain it!
Does that not seem terribly silly? Just look at the way it plays out. Rook and the gang rock up, all of a sudden somebody yells, "Look out!" And then these fucking robot things come out of nowhere spinning around. Doesn't it look like something out of a Pixar movie? I had a really hard time taking anything that happened right after this scene seriously at all. The whole tone of this scene seems like something you would just not put in a fantasy setting. And really, the whole concept of these Veil Jumpers is weird. They are Indiana Jones-like grave robbers that plunder elven tech. And that's the right word to use here. It's not like mystical artifacts or relics with symbolic and historical significance. It's like gadgets and devices. And there is something very anti-fantasy about this whole thing. Like the elven artifacts being this weirdly pseudo-technological technology feels so out of place. And the attitude of these Veil Jumpers in Bellara specifically to these artifacts is weird too. Remember the mystical reverence and almost fear and awe the Dalish would treat their culture and the remnants of their ancestry with? This almost religious reverence is what defined their attitudes towards their heritage. That mentality is what informed so much of their traditions and culture. That's what made them so believable in a fantasy setting. And it was good world building for a fantasy setting. By contrast, we have Balara, who is fumbling around the elven tech, cracking jokes and weird one-liners, going oops and yikes. It feels like a kid tampering with something she really does not have much respect for, which is weird considering that her entire story is supposed to be about preserving ancient elven heritage. But the way she is characterized, being this zany, cutesy, childlike character, serves to undermine any effectiveness this story could have brought. They even go so far as having her use modern language like okay.
They thought it would make it all okay.
Is there anything more anti-fantasy than using the word okay? And that's the big problem here. She just doesn't feel elven enough in a sense. She does not feel like an elf who comes from this mystical fantasy world the way that it's been built up in previous installments. Instead, she feels like a character out of a completely different Pixar-like movie. And that further serves to completely kill the tone of this supposedly fantasy setting. Issues of the design and characterization brought up permeate the game and do really hold weight. They're not so prevalent so as to overwhelm entirely, let's say, but they are consistent enough to justify some of the fan base being put off. To put it simply, it seems like BioWare simply forgot how to write fantasy and opted to use Avengers-like humor and tone in this game. This flies in the face of what BioWare fans grew to love about Origins and keeps with the trend of them, for some reason, delivering things like combat that no one wanted and fumbling iconic elements of the franchise that people loved, like the fantasy tone. So as far as I'm concerned, the criticism that this doesn't feel like a Dragon Age game at times is absolutely legitimate. Criticism number 2. Bad writing. And now it's time to talk about this game's story in a more extensive manner. I saw something online that I really think rings true when it comes to the story of this game. The plot overall is good. The mythos of what the wider story is cool and engaging. But it's the way we get there, the spaces in between, that are filled with some clumsy awkwardness. I really do think that that's true. I like where this game takes the story. Solas was supposed to be a significant presence, and I think for the most part, he is sufficiently so. The choice made to subvert expectations and to have him sort of not be the main villain of the game and being a questionable ally in the fight, while the question of him manipulating events to his end hanging over our heads as a constant thread throughout, is I think something that keeps with the sort of love-hate relationship the player has had with Solas ever since Inquisition. Solas has always been a conflicted character, being both noble and treacherous at times. The question of whether we want to defeat him or redeem him has hung in the air ever since Trespasser, and this game uses its premise to build arguments for both options. You both get to see Solas in his more noble light, and then at the same time, he keeps manipulating you up to the very end. This duality has been a prevailing theme with him as a character, and I think the game does a good job of developing it. And that persists all the way to the game's ending, where the final choice of the game allows you to explore both paths, having strong arguments to either. The way he interacts with Mythal, Morgan, and the Inquisitor in this final stage of the game adds to this and is done in a very nice way, scratching the itch of players who have been invested in this storyline adequately, to my mind at least. I also really like the shift away from Solas as the main villain, bringing in Elganon and Gillenane. They were mysterious and intimidating, and I saw their introduction as an opportunity for the game to delve deeper into established lore and give us something unexpected and interesting. The sort of overall idea of what the plot is, I think, is good. It kept me engaged and interested. I think it had a lot of potential. There are some additional cool concepts, I think, interwoven into the story that make it even better. An example of that would be the lighthouse and using the Eluvians to travel, exploring the crossroads. I thought it was a cool idea with a cool lore behind it. Certain story beats I found engaging as well, like the choices between Minrathous and Treviso. Some environments and subplots were also interesting. The setting of Treviso and the lore of the Crows I thought was the best setting in the game. They really made a concentrated effort to bring Antiva to life with all of its cultural intricacies, and I think they pulled that off. I felt immersed in the setting, and I think this single map has more character and immersion factor than any map in Inquisition by comparison. Same can be said about Minrathous. I found the decision to focus on Docktown and the lives of the more poverty-stricken citizens of the Tevinter Imperium to be an interesting one. Nev's subplot of crime and corruption eating away at the city, allowing for more nefarious forces like blood mages to take advantage, was interesting and engaging. Overall, the game's story brings forth a lot of things I liked and enjoyed. However, when focusing on details of how the plot actually progressed and some of the ancillary elements, the picture starts to become a bit blurry. Let's start off by looking at the most significant element, the main villains. The unfortunate fact is that the villains of this game are victims to what I would call the Corypheus effect. They get a strong entrance, setting up something promising to be intriguing, but then they are relegated to being mostly off-screen presences. We hear a lot about how evil they are, but for the most part they show up sparingly. Again, like with Corypheus, we are never given first-hand examples of how their potential threat. The only exception to this is the Demethus crossing sequence, which I do have to say was exceptionally well done. The Lovecraftian vibes that sequence gives, showing the corruption and the twisting effects of the blight unleashed by the gods, had a very gruesome edge to it. Showing the villains corrupting the minds of the villagers, their minds broken, was a very effective way of conveying the evil of our main antagonist. But much like the Haven sequence in Inquisition, which is the only time Corypheus comes off as a threat, this is unfortunately an isolated example. We get a little bit more of them with the Treviso Minrathous choice, but to my mind, that did not go deep enough to show us the gruesome aftermath of it to be more effective. I still think BioWare did a better job with Elganon and Gillenane than with Corypheus, thanks to it, but I do wish they went even further. The problem is further compounded by the fact that these two are never developed that much as characters. We are never really giving anything in terms of believable motivation or backstory to flesh them out a bit. In that sense, they're exactly like Corypheus. The game does a much better job fleshing out Solus through his constant presence in Rook's mental visions and with some additional quest lines, but the two elven gods are relegated to being just evil for the sake of being evil, and indeed the game leans into it by constantly telling us that they are evil. Oh, they are so evil, they are so very evil. They are like the evilest of the evil. Solus, for example, literally never stops harping on how evil they are. In the end, they just don't end up being as effective as they could have been, precisely because they're never humanized enough to make them believable. There is another issue with the main villains that I have to touch upon. I am torn on the fact that BioWare chose to link them to the Blight and use it as a tool to highlight their evilness. On one hand, some of the lore developments and answers given are interesting. I like the fact that they actually gave us a detailed account of the events that led to the creation of the Blight, and I think these lore developments are interesting enough to justify their existence. I see the build-up and the setup for these lore developments stretching as far back as Game 1, and on that front, I applaud the long-term storytelling that was pulled off here. Linking the Blight to the Elven Gods and the Titans is not bad on its face necessarily. I do, however, have some hang-ups, which are the following. 1. This decision actually serves to undercut the effectiveness of Elganon and Gillenane as villains, rather than enhances it. 2. This decision undermines the dramatic weight of the events of earlier games. And 3. It makes the game world feel smaller. The first point is that instead of introducing elements that make this game's villains distinct in their own right and conveying their threat through creative invocation and storytelling. What this game does is instead lean on previously established villains from the game's past to hype them up. Beyond linking them to the Blight specifically, I am also talking about the choice to link Gillinan and Elganon to the archdemons from previous games. I mean, imagine that in Mass Effect 5, we don't get like new villains with their own distinct character propelling the story forward, but are instead given a story where the villains of the game are actually the Super Reapers. Reapers who are bigger and scarier than the Reapers we knew from earlier games. It's kind of like what The Force Awakens did with the Death Star. Instead of taking the story in a new original direction, they chose the route of introducing an even bigger, scarier Death Star. And this is just lazy storytelling, man. The same happens here. You thought fighting one archdemon was bad. Well, now we have two archdemons. Not only that, but our new villains, they control them. So what you're basically doing is you're making a scary threat from earlier games that was effectively conveyed as being a scary threat, subservient to this game's villains, hyping them up as even more dangerous instead of doing that by introducing a new story element to make them stand out in their own right as a scary threat. In the end, you really do the new villains a disservice doing this, as they end up lacking their own identity, which further serves to make them bland. Further on to that, what you have also done is, you have undercut the significance of the events of earlier games. I mean, God, this is so lazy that not only did they introduce two archdemons to Origins as one, but they even go so far as calling what's happening in Veilguard the Super Blight. You thought that one Blight was bad in Origins? Well, now we have the Super Blight, the Blight to end all blights. And by doing that, you effectively undermine the weight of what happened in that game. In Origins, we spent the entire game in a desperate attempt to rally Ferelden against the Blight and barely succeeded. But that game had a much tighter focus, and the build-up to the final game's resolution was much bigger, and that was very effective in conveying the danger of the Blight itself. That game earned its narrative stakes, is what I'm saying. Veilguard does not build its own base to do that, but instead leans into concepts from earlier games and turns them up to 11. This makes what we managed to achieve in Origins sort of shrink in its significance as a result. You thought the archdemon was bad? Well, now we have two. But in Origins, we spent the whole game building up to fighting the archdemon, and in Veilguard, they were relegated to pets that get sort of throwaway deaths that carry very little narrative relevance to the game. Which makes, in retrospective, the effectiveness of the archdemon in Game 1 lesser as well. They even destroy Ferelden off screen, which makes this even worse. I understand you want to up the stakes, but this is not the way to do it. This trope is just lazy and frustrating to fans from earlier games. Not only is it lazy, but it serves to the detriment of the story you are trying to tell, as you did not give it its own identity, and beyond that, somehow you managed to lessen the effectiveness of the plot from earlier games and make it worse retroactively. And that is simply not going to sit well with the fanbase as a whole. And to add even more salt to the wound, this is also derivative because Corypheus already had a pet archdemon in Inquisition, which makes these choices even more baffling. Like, why would you rip off a lazy bad trope from your own previous game? This makes the issue of Veilguard's villains lacking their own identity even worse. The third point I want to touch upon is how this makes the game's world and lore smaller. The Blight, being this evil, mysterious force, added depth to the lore. Instead of the elven gods going in their own direction, you decide to bring all of these different elements of the lore together and link them with one neatly tied knot. All of a sudden, all of the evil in the world we face is giving a singular source. Instead of having space to expand the lore, introduce different elements, like maybe the Blight is linked to a deeper, different source of evil, the potential for storytelling has now all of a sudden shrunk. It's the Elven Gods. It's all about the Elven Gods, and now that we've defeated the Elven Gods, there is really nowhere to go. This point in particular is the one I'm the least bothered about, if I have to be honest, as it might be down to a personal preference. I simply don't like stories where the source of all evil and the resolution of every plotline comes down to the same thing. I prefer bigger worlds with different divulging plot elements interacting with each other to give you a richer experience. However, I do acknowledge the fact that this has apparently been the plan since game 1, and if this was the vision from the creators since the beginning, then who am I to question their vision? I also like long-term storytelling, and I'm a fan and a proponent that artists should be able to bring their artistic vision to fruition. And like I said, these lore additions are not bad per se. So really this might be down to my own personal preference more than anything else. The game does set up some interesting concepts to be explored in future games, some related to the Blight and the Grey Wardens. So this does give me hope that we will get to go to some interesting places after Veilguard. So we will see if this criticism of mine remains valid in my mind as further lore is introduced in game that will come in the future, and if these story decisions were actually for the better. And that's all I really have to say about the villains. The choice to introduce them and some of their surrounding lore is interesting, but how the game goes about presenting them as somewhat weak for the reasons I outlined. This keeps in line with the broader line of criticism, that being that the overall story is good, but some of the details are a flop. In that vein, I do have to talk a little bit about the plot involving the Grey Wardens. As part of the wider plot, some of the elements linked to the Grey Wardens and their developments are good. I think the Battle of Weishaupt was generally a highlight for a lot of players. The sequence itself is action-packed, dynamic, and exciting. They really put the pressure on you, and they do a good job of hyping up Gillenane with some striking visuals. However, some of the specific choices that relate to the way the Wardens are presented are a bit flat. The first Warden specifically feels like someone who the writers went out of their way to write as one-note and unlikable as possible. He is so abrasive and stubborn that it's almost comical by the end of it. They once again neglect to introduce some believable motivation to flesh him out as a character and left him being this empty blowhard. I guess they were going with the angle that he was being influenced by the gods subtly, but this is brushed off so casually that it carries really no impact. And that's a shame, because that could have been a very clever storyline angle if given a bit more attention and development. Overall, the shitty thing about making the first Warden so one-note also relates to the weird decision BioWare made all the way back in Inquisition to represent the Wardens as sort of incompetent dicks. And for a faction so iconic and beloved, this is just an illogical choice. You can only end up irking the fanbase even more by doing it. But I guess the Wardens are redeemed somewhat by Anton and Evka, so there's that. But the bigger problem here is they kind of make how you choose to deal with him sort of irrelevant. Like at the very end, after you kill Razikel the first time, and he shows up to kill the Archdemon, I thought, cool. So this is the result of me choosing to reason with him and not punch him in the face. He ends up taking the fall for Davrin, and the actual cost of choosing to put him down with a punch is losing one of your companions. But no, the first Warden just ends up getting bodied by Gillenane, regardless of what you choose, and Davrin just kills the Archdemon anyway without having to pay the ultimate sacrifice for some reason. That renders your choice rather meaningless and adds to make this storyline weaker overall. And the fact that they revert the lore so that a Warden can kill an Archdemon without dying was done in a very lame fashion without any suitable explanation. And these are examples serving to show how the story overall is good, but in some of its finer details, it starts to unravel. The way the Wardens are linked to the story and the overall sequence in Weishaupt is good, but small things like making the first Warden so one-note and such an asshole, rendering the choices of how you handle him meaningless, and retconning the lore so that a warden can kill an archdemon without dying takes the whole storyline down a peg. The finer details is once again where this game's story unravels and falls apart. And while we're still on this criticism, we would be remiss to not talk about the companions. The companions are such an integral part of your game's experience, and how they're written and presented really matters as to whether the overall story is going to end up being as impactful as it could have been. The idea behind forming a team to take down the gods is a good premise, but what that team actually ends up looking like and your experience spending time with these companions is ultimately what is going to determine whether you find the journey as a whole and the end resolution satisfying. And once again, when you get down to the finer details of how these companions are written and brought to life, that is where you start to encounter some issues. The companions are really a bit of a downward slope. Some are, I think, good. Lucanus, for me, was an absolute highlight. He had an interesting concept to him. He brings a very cool edge being an assassin, but at the same time, he is not one note, just some silent badass in the background. No, I feel like he has a lot of humanity to him. We see him being ruthless at times, but we also are given glimpses of his more human side as well. He is vicious when he has to be, but also has a very personable attitude when appropriate, which makes him come off as a sensible man. His humanity shines through in a game that often gives you one-note cliches as characters. BioWare also manages to achieve something that, as we will later see, they struggle with in this game. Humor. Lucanus manages to bring some levity to the game through actual wit. He never feels too comedic, something that would prevent you from taking him seriously. Humor is integrated into his character in a believable way, and is used to further flesh him out and add to his charm and appeal. Overall, truly a great character to my mind. Below him a notch is Nev. I had my hang-ups about Nev. When I found out she was a private investigator, I could not help but laugh at that idea. I mean, I was sure this would be another example of anti-fantasy, refer to my earlier example of the Veil Jumpers, introduced that would undermine the setting. I mean, in this world of knights, wizards, and monsters, we're gonna have a PI solving murders, putting like papers on a wall, like something out of a noir flick. It just didn't gel well to my mind. But to my surprise, despite Nev being exactly that, it actually worked. They pulled it off. And it wasn't annoying. In fact, to my surprise, they managed to integrate the storyline into the wider world in such a way that it actually added to the setting. The way her storyline interacts with and plays out in the wider setting of the Imperium and Docktown actually introduced a lot of interesting elements. It helped further develop and add to the themes of corruption, inequality, and evil opportunistically taking advantage of this environment. It all felt very Dragon Age 2-ish, but in a good way. All in all, Nev and her plot were cleverly pulled off and added to the story and lore, which is why she also ended up being a highlight. Davrin and Harding were also nice. They were solid, a constant reliable presence, both having a strong moral compass, but unfortunately they both lack some of the spice necessary to really elevate them as top-tier characters. They ended up being a bit bland, but are by no means objectionable. They don't take away from the game and make it worse, so they get a pass from me, which can't be said for the following three. Emmerich is not particularly offensive by any means, but I am afraid that with him this game starts to step into the territory of goofiness that really serves to undercut the tone. Here is where some of the criticism of weak character writing starts to creep in. Don't get me wrong, I found Emmerich charming and fun, but some of the choices made to bring his character to life are simply taking slow steps into cartoon land. One, his personality is too bubbly. He is always happy, go-lucky, and positive to the extent it almost gets annoying. He is too nice. He lacks an edge to him completely. He needed some darkness to him to really make him feel a bit more human. He is so nice, he almost feels like something out of Toy Story. The fact that they decided to introduce a quirky skeleton as his sidekick really doesn't help. I mean, I did warm up to Manfred eventually, but the decision to introduce him really doesn't help the case against goofiness. Having a talking skeleton run around just adds to Emmerich feeling like something out of Pixar. Granted, we have had goofy companions before, like the one and only Shale, so this is why I do give Manfred somewhat of a pass, but it doesn't end with him. Emmerich's whole story feels like you are transported to some other world outside of Dragon Age. Instead of believable world building to flesh out Nevarra, we get to go out to these weirdly looking locations. Everything about Emmerich's quest is so over the top and cheesy, spooky and scary that it becomes hokey. We get this scene with the hand.
Lovely to have my hand back.
We also get a villain who looks like the Bride of Frankenstein, and a giant zombie skeleton at the end to boot. I don't know, me being a fan of dark, gritty political realism with good world building in a fantasy setting, found myself taken out and transported to a place that had more Hotel Transylvania vibes than fantasy. I will give this whole plotline credit though. It was certainly different. It was a bit too much at times for sure, ergo the hand scene, and Bioware could have massively improved it by toning it down a bit and making them more believable, but the eccentricity of this whole plotline did keep me engaged, I'll give it that. But stuff like this is where I can see a lot of the criticism as to the writing of the game coming from. And it's also a prime example of how the game's story falls apart in some of its finer details. On the one hand, you have Nev's quest that fleshes out the world in a believable way, and then moments later, you get a scene with a hand crawling on the ground and the grandma from Fright Night giving a spooky monologue. And unfortunately, Emmerich isn't the worst offender when it comes to this. I've already touched upon Bellara a bit. She and the Veil Jumpers are just tone destroying. There is something at the heart of her character that has potential. Being an elven historian, that fits with the overall plot in a nice way. But her execution, the characterization is just atrocious. I thought Sarah was annoying, but God, Sarah still felt like an annoying character in the world of Dragon Age. Bellara is straight out of Looney Tunes. If Emmerich breaks your immersion a bit, she takes a sledgehammer to it. Instead of somber reverence and a deep care for elven history, which would have kept with how elves and specifically the Dalish have been portrayed before, and would have also kept with the fantasy tone, Bellara is anti-fantasy incarnate. She is too quirky, too childlike. Every attempt at humor with her is jarring, so much so that it becomes almost abrasive by the end of it all. It's no coincidence some clips used by more critical side of the internet discussion on Veilguard feature Bellara specifically. Man, we have had similar characters in terms of cuteness like Meryl, but Bellara is literally the worst of Meryl with a decent amount of extra cringe piled on top. She feels like a bad attempt to introduce Marvel movie-like humor to the series, but it's so bad that every joke or gag they try to do with her is so cheesy, it just falls completely flat. She is the type of character who you could believably see saying lines like, guys, you're gonna want to see this," or "he's right behind me, isn't he?" And that is categorically bad writing for sure. With her, this criticism of bad writing holds a tremendous amount of weight. And then there's Tosh. Now let me clear something up. To me personally, Bellara takes the annoying cake. I personally dislike her more than Tosh. Tosh I personally found to be cool. Belara is, to my personal taste, the worst character. But objectively speaking, I think Tosh is the queen of poorly written characters in this game. She's a perfect illustration of how concepts, overall structure, and ideas in the game are good, but execution when it comes down to the finer details falls apart as poorly written. The concept of Tosh, as a character, is actually an intriguing one. It adds some interesting world building. The concept of devout follower of the Qun, this more extreme religion, fleeing her homeland to protect her child from the dogmas of that religion, but then struggling with her identity and being a parent, and that falling on Tosh as being said child being brought up in this environment of conflict between her mother's more, for lack of a better word, conservative Qunari attitude and the more free-loving culture of Ravane is a cool concept for a character. It brings a lot of interesting dynamics and raises interesting questions. It provides a window into Qunari culture, showing us a more humanized perspective of what living under the Qun would be, some of the choices you would have to make. What would you do if you were in the shoes of Tasha's mother? Do you continue living under this religion at the cost of your own child? Or do you leave behind everything you knew, everything you were taught to be behind, risking it all to protect your child? And Tosh having to deal with all of this baggage, struggling as any young person does to find their own place in the world, that's an interesting backdrop that could have given rise to interesting storytelling. For the most part, when the game focuses on this conflict with Tosh, it is interesting. Not enough attention and depth, unfortunately, is given to all of this. But the bigger problem is that wrapped up in this interesting concept for a character, Tosh herself is written like a bratty 21st century teenager. I mean, some level of angst and conflict with her parents should have been expected. That was very neatly interwoven into Tosh's setup as a character. She is young and struggling to find her place in the world. Her mother's overbearing Qun-motivated cultural background influences her on one side, growing up in Ravane does on the other. Torn between these two extremes, she is trying to make sense of who she really is. There is nothing wrong with that kind of setup. In fact, if done well, it could have been interesting, if executed properly. The problem is that for some reason, BioWare just could not write this type of character in any way that's believable and that fits in the context of the world. Tosh feels too modern. If Belara's dialogue is out of place, using contemporary words like okay, all of Tosh's dialogue follows steadily in that vein. There is a reason I described her as a 21st century teenager. The angst and adolescent struggle for identity is portrayed in the game the same way a bratty teen living in current-day USA would experience it. Adding to this, BioWare absolutely flop at humor with Tosh. She has these one-liners that are supposed to add some levity, but they are written in a way that's so out of place that they end up being cringy. One example I can think of is how she chimes in a scene, the scene being exposition on how Solus and Mythal interacted and what their relationship was like, and she chimes in saying something goofy about how they were doing it.
So they were doing it.
The elven gods were free with their emotions. They felt things deeply. The way they express things, well, it feels romantic to us, but that wasn't really how it was. Back then, I mean.
Nah, they were doing it.
That's something a goofy modern teenager would say, not a person believably living in this medieval-inspired fantasy world. Her whole shtick is exactly that. She talks in Ks and sups, and every time she uses such modern language, she reminds you of some kind of kid in school trying to be cool. And that's just not how you explore the question of adolescent confusion and finding yourself in a fantasy context effectively. It takes you out of the setting, it's annoying when it happens, and it happens constantly. So, as far as Tosh is concerned, I can safely say that while good as a concept, her execution in terms of writing is pretty poor. And that keeps on with the general trend. Ideas and overall plot is good, but execution of the finer details tends to fall apart through poor writing. So as far as this criticism goes, I think I've given enough support to the claim that at times this game does suffer from some annoyingly bad writing. Though it's not all bad and some ideas and elements are actually pretty cool, their execution in principle leaves much to be desired. The main plot has cool setup, but lacks sufficient depth. The villains are cool ideas, but are never developed and rely on some lazy tropes. Some of the side plots fall apart due to certain elements, and some of the characters that accompany you are a pleasure to interact with, while others will just plain annoy you. So, the bad writing criticism, it holds weight at times, certainly. And with that being said, it's time to tackle the toughest part of this video. Talking about that one element that stirred up the most controversy. See, I purposefully left out a very important element of Tosh as a character. The one element that attracted the most attention and caused the most debate and outrage online. Her non-binary identity. The decision to make her non-binary and to include that in the game is the spark that caused the whole powder keg around Veilguard to explode. The game was labeled as part of the woke trend that is shaping and sweeping through media in recent times, being absolutely dragged through the mud for it. So, what's the verdict here? Was the game too woke and were these attacks deserved? Well, to answer that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring in some necessary context, and bear with me, things will get a bit abstract. Criticism 3. Too woke? There are certain considerations that need to be paid in order to answer the question of whether this game, or any media for that matter, can be labeled as being too woke. The primary question we need to ask is really, what does that even mean? The most prevalent take on what too woke means that I've seen is that writers will go out of their way to introduce a sort of forced representation at the expense of good writing, properly integrating said representation into the story you're trying to tell and the world you're trying to build. Representation thus feels quota-based as opposed to something that could have naturally occurred organically in the setting of the story. A good example would be race swapping in historical movies where, despite, for example, having the movie take place in Elizabethan England, you have black actors play English lords. There are plenty of examples from recent memory, but the goal of this video is not to dive too deep on this particular point. Once we establish what being too woke actually means, we need to look at the game and determine if that applies. So, there are contravening points that need to be mentioned here. On the one hand, some will adamantly maintain these criticisms are founded, while on the other, some will say that this is simply hate and bigotry and there's nothing more to that. And maybe this is the case, especially considering Dragon Age has always strived to be inclusive. The first game gave us 2 bisexual romances. The second opted to make all romances bisexual. Inquisition had its exclusively gay and lesbian romances, with a trans character thrown in there as well. And for the most part, none of these were points of controversy. In fact, to this day, people really love characters like Zevran, Leliana, or Dorian. So what's different now? Is it just a reaction from an increasingly vocal, hateful, bigoted crowd online? Or does Veilguard simply do something so drastically different this time to warrant this reaction? Unfortunately, to my mind, I would say that it is in fact the latter, and these criticisms, they are actually more reasonable than maybe some people would like to admit. See, with a character like Zevran, for example, his sexuality was never really a big point, constantly being highlighted through the duration of Origins. It was there, and he didn't hide it, but we were given so much more in terms of his characterization. His wit, his humor, his charming attitude, he had a tragic backstory. He was just given a lot to flesh him out as a character. He never felt one-dimensional to the extent you felt like he was introduced to be the avatar of gayness, like some token representation inclusion. Same can be said for Dorian. He had a lot more going on as a character separate from his sexuality that made him feel like a believable person. On top of that, any issues related to his sexuality and the conflict he had with his father, because of that, was handled well through clever writing, humanizing him even more. And these are the reasons why these characters are still beloved, and no one batted an eye at their inclusion. They were simply representation done right, tastefully, and in a believable way. They were good characters first and foremost, and that made all the difference in the world. Now, with Tosh, I don't really think we have the same. Separate from her being written like a bratty modern teenager, the way her identity is incorporated into her storyline does not serve to humanize her and give her depth. Or them depth, I guess. It feels entirely tacked on. It's not incorporated into the backdrop of her setup as a character in some meaningful way at all. It just kind of becomes a point of discussion out of nowhere. And after that, instead of clever writing, we get some of the most basic cookie-cutter dialogue and scenes to explore it. It's basically written like going through the motions. She figures out she's non-binary, tells her mom is confused. Tosh gets angry and says, "You don't understand me, Mom." It's like so basic and unimaginative. It's like it's taken out of a pamphlet. That's how it truly feels. It feels like some activist wrote how you should react and behave if your parents don't accept your gender identity, and it just copy-pasted from there. It does not help humanize Tosh and her mom by giving us some sincere, believable interactions between a parent and a child. To cap it off, we even get a very cliché, just be yourself message at the end, which is what the point of this storyline was trying to convey was. It's so tacked on and uninspired in execution that you can't help but feel like the main accusation of this just being forced diversity holds merit. It feels like BioWare conceived of this character and her cool backstory, then decided they really needed to include some non-binary representation in this game, and then wrote everything around this decision. Instead of writing the trait into the character, they wrote the character into the trait. And because of that, this whole thing sticks out like a sore thumb. This becomes a singular defining characteristic of Tosh, which makes her feel like a vessel for representation rather than a character first. And that differentiates her and this whole thing from examples of earlier representation, which is why it rubbed people the wrong way, whilst previous examples didn't. It's very clearly ideologically informed. So, on that front, I feel like people criticizing this game for being too woke, though it might be pleasant for some to admit, have a point. Conclusion: a product of its time. Now, at the beginning of this video, I said that after all the smoke had cleared and I had actually played the game, I managed to reach a conclusion that really helped me make sense of this game and some of the decisions that figured into its creation. It helped me make peace with it because it helped me understand and come to terms with where this game fits in the wider franchise as a whole. And I think this conclusion really serves to explain a lot of the criticisms and the reactions to these criticisms online. Now, there are a lot of factors that contribute to the issues outlined. EA's influence and interference definitely was a significant factor and reason behind the franchise slowly moving away from its roots. Some elements in earlier games, like multiplayer, were introduced due to influence from EA. Veilguard was supposed to be a live service game at one point, and that back and forth that ultimately took it away from live service to single player is something that definitely impacted game design. Some might also point to the exodus of a lot of senior staff at BioWare as a contributing factor to the decrease in writing quality. But beyond these specifics, is there a deeper reason that, at least to my mind, defined and made this game what it is, especially when it comes to the heightened wokeness that forms part of this game? See, it's by no means news to anybody that we live in a culture war. The cultural divide that defines so much of American politics, and by extension global politics, considering the immense influence American affairs and culture have on the international scene, inevitably bleeds over into the media. We are witness to a trend where more artistically inclined people, those who comprise the creative drive behind media in any medium, be it film, music, or video games, has embraced more and more that side of the cultural divide that can be broadly categorized as left. On the other side, we have people who have been increasingly feeling alienated by this shift for the simple reason that vast swaths of the population can't agree with and get on board with some of the postulates that the modern left is espousing. To my mind, this is an inevitable result of the collapse of neoliberalism, with its stipulations becoming increasingly extreme as this ideology slowly reaches the edges of its logical extensions. I myself can't say I agree with some of its stipulations. I don't think gender is a social construct. I am a perfect example of your average Joe who feels increasingly alienated by these assertions. But, on the other side, more artistically inclined people working in the arts disagree and are following through with trying to be champions of what is considered to be a culturally left-leaning position. And they try to convey this through their art. I do believe that these people are acting in good faith and are simply doing what they think is right. But in this climate of current cultural division, this will inevitably cause alienation and controversy from an increasing amount of people who disagree. And that lies at the heart of the division that Veilguard caused. Veilguard carries the marks of modern culture, and naturally by extension it also carries the marks of the division modern culture is defined by. It is very much so a product of its time in that sense. Much like Origins and DA2 carried the spirit of their times, Veilguard is in this sense also a character of the spirit of its time. And unfortunately, this means controversy is interwoven into its identity. I do believe that a lot of the issues with the game's writing and design would not have caused such heated debate online by themselves, but Veilguard carries just enough of the modern cultural imprint to trigger and become engulfed in the debate that characterizes the division of the current cultural landscape. But beyond the diagnosis, this realization is, I think, also comforting. Culture shifts. Inevitably, this cultural divide will change into something else. The divisions that separate us are temporary, and the media we consume being a reflection of this also is. Eventually, when reconciliation through cultural revolution comes, new media, new games will reflect in turn that. The inflammatory nature of Veilguard does not need to define the whole franchise and cement its future. As times change and culture shifts, future Dragon Age games will reflect that. This whole hysteria is temporary. Veilguard's controversy is nothing but a time capsule. Don't write off the whole franchise as doomed to repeat its mistakes endlessly in the future. And eventually, it is more than likely that future installments will also again become something that we can all celebrate in unity rather than something that divides us. And that is the optimistic realization that helped me make peace with Veilguard and all of its flaws ultimately. And is also, I think, a rather optimistic note to conclude on. Until that given time when the next iteration of this franchise comes out and we can again sink our teeth into the world of Thedas, don't forget why you love these games and never forsake hope, and always remember,
in peace, vigilance. In war, victory.